the system was every engineer was basically an advocate, which is like a great way to start your company. Like I honestly think most companies, instead of hiring a proper advocate, like hire engineers that don't mind talking. Get someone who knows your product like very intimately, but also can talk about it. Like that's extremely valuable. So think about that when you're thinking about your first couple hires.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools, the show that investigates how DevTools go from 0 to 1. I'm joined today by Brian Douglas, who is also known as bdougie on the internet and is the founder of OpenSauced, the open source intelligence platform. Brian was previously DevX lead at Netlify before becoming director of developer advocacy at GitHub, all the way through to IPO, I think. Not IPO, sorry, Microsoft acquisition.
Acquisition, yeah.
Yeah. And was also on Showmic's Software Snack Bites episode. So thanks to Showmic for introducing us to Brian. Thanks so much for joining, Brian.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm super excited to dig in and talk dev tools and my journey through them.
Yeah, I mean, you've been there at like the early stages of some of the most iconic dev tools. And one of the things you spoke about on Showmic's podcast was about when you first joined GitHub and you first joined Netlify, and you kind of went in with this plan of 30, 60, 90 of what you were going to do in the first days. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what your plan was when you joined and if there's any changes that you would make now.
Yeah, in hindsight, always things you would change, but also you wonder if you change something else, would the journey be different, or would you even be at this place? Because like at Netlify, so I joined as employee number 3. I was a year I spent as a customer. Well, honestly, I was a user because they didn't have a paid plan. But I was just a power user and had a blog and a podcast because just wanted to host myself on the internet and talk about stuff that I was working on. And so in that experience, it was an interview, but it was like a coffee chat, really. They pitched me on joining the team based on my background in sales, but also my years as an engineer, to be like one of the first I was like the first non-head of engineering person. So like they had a head of infrastructure, they had a CTO, and then there was me. And I came in this to do some front end work. Ironically, I interviewed in Go, but then got a JavaScript job. But I digress. The 36 to 90, like in that conversation, they're like, "Hey, how would you make impact if you joined our team?" And I was like, "Oh, let me just give you a 30, 60, 90." And they kind of were taken aback because it's more of like a sales plan or a business development plan than the engineering. But my whole thing was that Netlify was doing something very different. They were taking what normally you would do on S3, and they were providing a better experience. We didn't have to zip your project and upload it to AWS console, which was like a behemoth that was hard to use back in the day. And within the first 30 days, my pitch was like, first, make the product good. Like the plan was to move to React at that point from Angular, and then add some other cool features and onboarding tools. And then within the first 60 days, my pitch to them was like, go to every single bootcamp and teach those bootcamp students how to build their portfolio. Because it's low effort. You just build a template and then you ship it on Netlify. And the goal was within the first 30 seconds to a minute of you hearing the name Netlify, you should have a site up and running. Because again, like we're just like closing the gap on things like S3 and GitHub Pages. And we would just make it a lot easier. So it was possible. So when I joined, I did just that. Like I would go do a conference talk in a city. So I mapped out all NFL cities. So there's 32 NFL teams in the US. If there's a team in the NFL, it means it's a big enough market, which means there's probably a university close by. And there's probably a boot camp close by as well. So the goal was like go to the city, meet bootcamp founders, meet college professors and CS programs, and teach those students how to use Netlify. And then whenever I would do that, I'd leave with a curriculum of like, hey, if you want to embed this, it's just a standard URL where you can take the markdown. It's also a GitHub repo, and you can embed this into your curriculum to teach all your students how to build a portfolio. And to success, it worked. So we would grow. By the time I left, I think we were approaching like 400,000 or 500,000 users. I don't know the exact number because my whole thing is like I don't want to pay attention to number and then obsess over it. So I never really tracked numbers that way, but every now and then, like we'd have an all hands and they would mention it. But yeah, that was my 30, 60, 90 is like get attached to the actual funnel of where developers are coming in. And then 3-4 years from then, like everyone is using Netlify, which became pretty realistic because like some random people I just run into is like, hey, I'm learning how to code. Here's my portfolio. And it's like a netlify.app. And I'm like, oh, it worked.
Could you actually like tell us a bit about like, so you joined and you were like, okay, day one of actually getting boot camps or going to these cities, like what was it actually like on the kind of like implementation of that strategy?
Yeah. So it was, when I joined, I really was just engineering. We were just trying to build the application that was working. And we shipped this feature called Deploy Previews, which is embeds into your GitHub PR. And it'll give you a link to be able to preview your Netlify deploy. It was pretty novel. We weren't the first people to do this. Like Heroku was actually the first company to do it. They called it Heroku Pipelines. But Heroku was like, we don't want to embed into GitHub, like come to Heroku. So they did it like kind of clunky. But Netlify is like distribution. At that point, it was like 5 people at the company. So let's just embed in GitHub and do like the GitHub way. And it worked out that the CTO previously worked at GitHub and had a very deep understanding of the GitHub API, which is how I learned how to use the GitHub API pretty well, and why I do OpenSauced today. But yeah, what I'm getting at is like the first 3 months to 4, like that summer, was just really just like building the ground game of like make the product good, like make sure people can use it, make sure that it's discoverable. And then that summer I joined, Create React App came out, which Create React App is like the CLI that the team created internally at Meta, but it became a community project, still exists, where you get this like CLI tool to create a React app. And because that came out, you could create a new React app, and then you could Netlify deploy all from the command line. So you could deploy a Netlify site in 30 seconds, basically. So I wrote the blog post, 30 seconds to deploy React. And it actually did pretty well. It got on Hacker News. Hacker News, like the Create React app got on Hacker News, but then we like were fast followers of it because we were just not planning to be it. Like, cause I just thought it was cool because everyone was like rah about Create React app. So I built that. Well, I didn't even build anything. I just wrote the blog post. Like, here's the guide of how to do it. It was like 500 words. And so like once we set up the structure of like the product worked and people could discover it, at that point, there's a lot of boot camps in San Francisco. So I would just talk to all the boot camps I knew, because previously I worked at a boot camp building out their dashboard. Previously it's Block.io, which is now Thinkful. Knowing boot camp leaders from that experience, I would just go to boot camps in San Francisco first and test out, hey, would you like this curriculum? Like, would you like basically this URL, use it for your, like, link it in your resources. You don't have to rewrite anything. Like, we'll maintain it. But link it in your resource, how to build your portfolio, and it'll be using Netlify. And like, we'd sponsor, well, actually we didn't sponsor anything. I would just show up and do like a lunch and learn, basically. And that was it. And like, folks would just love me forever because I came to talk to the students about how I transitioned my career into being full-time engineering, but also while doing that talk, I would say, hey, here's Netlify, here's how to use it. And it became like the perfect situation to do that. So then my goal when I joined Netlify is like, I just wanted to do a conference talk because I just wanted to talk about just something, like get on stage one day. And I did that. And then I would send that same CFP to other NFL cities. And every time I got accepted, then the plan was like 4 ideas, but 3 touch points. So at least either 2 boot camps, if it was like Chicago, had like 3 or 4 of them. So I spoke to like 3 of them there. I went to a conference. I also spoke at a meetup, and I would call out the meetup organizers and be like, hey, I saw you on meetup.com. I'm going to be in the city. I know your meetup's on this day, but I'll be here on these days. Like, do you want to, like, we'll sponsor pizza from Netlify, which is like what, $500 or whatever. And I'll come and speak about deploying React apps and building your portfolio in 30 seconds. So that was the game, like just doing that. It took about probably 6 months before I started traveling to do that. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed like getting on a plane and being super cheap, staying on Airbnbs and stuff like that, and really having no budget. But conferences would pay for your travel if you got accepted. So that was sort of how we got to kind of see this thing grow.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like such a, kind of, there's a lot of hustle there. If you were, I mean, I guess like DevTools listening, they might be thinking like, oh, cool, let's just go start hitting up all the boot camps and tell them to not tell them, but, can I, to show you how to use our tool. But I imagine that may not work as well now because it's like because it was a new strategy.
Yeah. And I'd say boot camps were still like, they hit their pinnacle point. Well, now it's like, there's less boot camps. Well, there's a lot of boot camps, but I don't think it's as vibrant of a space. Like, definitely go talk to bootcamp students and get them to use your stuff. So that way they become experts in 4 years, and then they embed it into whatever a future company is. But like, you could take that same model and go to live streamers on Twitch or YouTubers on YouTube and say, hey, you've got a community, or you have a Discord. Be like, hey, we built a Discord integration built on Replit, and it uses this one API, which is our API. But like, we're to show people how to build Discord bots to do XYZ. And you go shop that around, which is like, it's business development. It's like sales 101. It's like, go figure out whatever the repeatable way to knock on doors. And it's like the law of averages. Like, the more doors you knock on, the more chances that people will say yes. And then more opportunity you have when that content lives forever within the community. And that's like the one thing I learned so GitHub, my 30, 60, 90 for GitHub was actually, and I had very similar, which we're trying to empower marketplace integrations and build on top of the API and GraphQL. I only did that for like probably the first 6 months, and then we went directly into GitHub Actions because GitHub Actions shipped, and that was like the better solution. But it was the same deal, but the difference was I was going to communities, and GitHub explicitly does not have the GitHub community. Like, there's no GitHub Discord, or there's a GitHub Discord, but it's not maintained by GitHub. There's like the GitHub Reddit, but it's not maintained by GitHub. But there's like all these other avenues that are not GitHub, like JavaScript and TypeScript and Rust and React. So explicitly, it was just go become best friends with all the maintainers of all these projects and all these communities, and make sure they knew who to contact when they had a question about GitHub. And that was the goal. It's like, we go talk to these folks, but it was the same thing as most dev tool startups. Like, build up the Rolodex so that way, whenever you need a speaker at a conference, or we need to like do a one-off, interaction for whatever feature we're sort of testing in whatever community, is like, build up that muscle of, hey, we're shipping a feature. Could you give us like 15 minutes to like a quick demo? And also, could you implement this so we can talk about you at GitHub Universe? So like, at the point where GitHub Actions was shipping in 2019, GitHub Actions shipped in 2018. But 2019 is when GitHub Actions shipped CI. So we could do build tooling and DevOps, like proper DevOps inside of GitHub Actions. The goal was to get all the top projects in open source using GitHub Actions. And the question was like, what are the top projects? And it was funny. It was like, not funny. It was like ironic that most people didn't know what the top projects at GitHub were. And the answer was never stars internally. And it's also never externally. Like, stars is not the metric for growth because like jQuery has 50,000 stars, but jQuery is in maintenance mode. So like, did you reach out to jQuery? No. So we ended up building the algorithm internally for identifying what the top 100 projects were. And then we had to figure out, okay, how do we make impact really quickly about something that's brand new and people don't have a lot of context on? So we chose JavaScript as a language because JavaScript top language was easy to see that in the data that we had. Everyone could see that data. So we found the top 25 JavaScripts for the top 100 list. It's really top 500, but the top 100, we'll call it that. And for the DevRel team, for me, because at the point we had 2 developer advocates on the team at GitHub up until I think 2020. Yeah, 2020 was when we actually hired. We absorbed some folks from Microsoft, but basically 2 people. And the goal was like, how do you get GitHub Actions leveraged in these popular open source projects? So we had the 25, and then all I did was DM people and message people on Twitter. Hey, GitHub Actions is shipping CI. Do you want to test it? Let me know if we can jump on a call. And by Friday, so I was like, I mean, it might have been like Friday to Friday, but by Friday we had 20 of the 25 using GitHub Actions in some part of the organization.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it sounds like it's like a lot of things that GitHub is so already people are using it, like a core part of it at least. And they know about GitHub, but they're not necessarily like using all the things that you want. And so you're kind of building that relationship and making sure they know all the stuff that you can be useful.
Yeah, GitHub did a great job in sort of the bottom-up strategy for adoption. So the first 4 years, GitHub took no VC money at all. Like they were bootstrapping it, and we're building out the product for the $5 a month for private repos for the longest time. Yeah, up until 2012, I think was their first round of funding or first institutional. Might have been a little later than that, to be honest. But so they had such good adoption. And everyone just knew GitHub because they were just at a good time in the market to convince people to use Git and use GitHub. So the system was every engineer was basically an advocate. So I was the first proper developer advocate hired in 2018. Prior to that, like if an engineer loved doing open source and they were hired, then you'd ask that engineer, hey, can you talk to the Rails community about this thing we're working on? It was always like word of mouth, which is like a great way to start your company. Like I honestly think most companies, instead of hiring a proper advocate, like hire engineers that don't mind talking. Like hire engineers that don't mind writing a blog post, because that's the hardest thing. It's like get someone who knows your product like very intimately, but also can talk about it. And that's what I did at Netlify, and that's why my career sort of shifted into this space. But it's the same thing. Like when you hire your first engineer as well, like hire engineers that can be product managers, because like adding another product manager when you have a burn rate and you're taking on capital or you're bootstrapping, like that's an extra mouth to feed basically. But if you hire an engineer that really intimately knows your product and can be product manager and can like triage issues and can ask questions to users, like that's extremely valuable. So think about that. Like I said, your listeners, think about that when you're thinking about your first couple hires. But because that was the way GitHub was built, there was tons of people and like no Rolodex, like no idea of who to talk to. And as GitHub becomes mature and gets acquired by Microsoft, people leave. So it ended up being, I was there before Microsoft, but I was able to meet all the people who knew all the people and had like built a network, because my job was like become friends with everyone in GitHub, outside of GitHub. And so, and in some ways I was kind of the last man standing. Like there was a lot of people that were still there for years, but like, I'm not going to reach out to Mike McQuaid and be like, hey, Mike, can you intro me? Like he would do that, but like Mike doesn't want to do DevRel or, anyway, I could name drop a bunch of other people, but like not everyone wants to be an advocate or do DevRel and send emails and plan conferences and organize meetups to bootcamps and lunch and learns. But I was the weird one that didn't mind doing that and shipping code. Sorry, I'm like trailing off. Basically, I already forgot the original thought that I was actually going down.
I think it was just the whole like 30, 60, 90, right? Was it that? I think that was the main. We're still on the same thread. Yeah. Yeah. I think we were just on that thread. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, it's that the thing that I always taken it back on, because I do a podcast as well. And I do a lot of angel investing. And my whole thing is like, you have to, for getting adoption for developers, doing that bottom up strategy, which I recommend for a lot of folks, you gotta have to talk about the vision and like where this thing is going and like what are the possibilities. So like even before we shipped CI for GitHub Actions, I remember speaking at Jamstack NYC and talking about how you could build CI on GitHub Actions. And I was actually in Barcelona at Full Stack Fest, and I was talking about how you could build CI with GitHub Actions. And then we shipped CI with GitHub Actions. But it was like I was showing the hard way to do it, to show like the pain, show like what's possible. Because like in the day, like CI existed on GitLab, CLI existed in Circle and Jenkins. But the challenge is like no one built CI in a way that was like truly open and that you could share across ecosystems. I guess GitLab. I never used GitLab Lab CLI, CI, but I think they did have an open version. But building the basically building the standard for, okay, now you can do CI. Like basically, frankly, I don't work at GitHub anymore, but frankly, what GitHub did is they commoditize CI and CD to the point where, like, if you're a CI CD company today in 2023, like you're more of a bespoke or a niche product, and you have to build this, like, the thing on top of it. And I think it's the same thing. Like, no one's building orchestration software unless you're building on top of Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is a standard. So, like, why would you go build that again when Kubernetes is good enough? And, like, I think we have to get a little more time away to figure out what the next thing is when it comes to orchestration. But and maybe that's coming. Maybe someone already has something out there. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's like going back to, like, my original mention. And I think what I was talking about is, like, being the sort of advocate. The first advocate at GitHub is, like, figure out how to scale yourself in a way that you don't have to be the person always doing the conversations and the talking.
Yeah, I think you've spoken a lot about creating advocates or kind of identifying advocates in the community.
Yeah, the number one job for a developer advocate is to create other advocates for your product. So, like, if you're the only one that can walk in the room and talk about that product because you're the only one that cares, then you're not doing a job. Like, it's got to be at a point where you can take a step back and watch the machine start. And that's what I was doing with the whole bootcamp thing, which, like, everyone got the aha moment of, like, oh wow, I thought I had to, like, sign up for S3 and, like, configure the AWS CLI and, like, do all this, like, random stuff. And now you can just, like, connect your GitHub account to Netlify and you deploy, like, in 30 seconds and you're good. And then, like, once you figure out that base layer of, like, the pain point you solve, now everyone gets to go solve harder problems. So now it's like the next thing was, like, oh, how do you do headless CMSs? How do you connect my WordPress to a Netlify site? Or how do I do, like, background jobs? Or how do I do, like, all that? Those problems are the next things that Netlify ended up solving later on. But, like, we were able to move past that pretty quickly. And I think, like, even when I'm working on with OpenSauced, like, the challenge that I've been trying to solve with the intelligence around open source is a lot of people, like, there's this two completely separate things that people are working on, which is, I'm a developer, I want to do open source, so I'm going to, like, go do Hacktoberfest, or I'm going to go connect my profile to this thing that's going to recommend me places to go contribute to. But then there's also, I'm a maintainer, I can't sustain this project because I need funding. I need people to help contribute with me. Like, how do I even find people to contribute alongside of me? And, like, very few times people actually cross and say, oh, maybe I should go talk to maintainers and help them out. Or maybe I should go talk to contributors and help them out. But no one's like, oh, let me just create an ecosystem where everyone can just hang out and talk. And I see countless amount of, like, projects that do either or and don't have, like, the sort of middle ground for discovery. And I think the challenge is most people think GitHub's going to ship this. And GitHub has shipped a lot of these pieces, but there's no, like, story to, like, really make this thing work.
Yeah, like, I guess the only thing is, like, the trending sort of stuff that you can see popular projects, but on the other side of it, I don't know.
Yeah, and the trending is the same problem for stars right now, because the trending, it's, yeah, if you ship 1,000 commits, so, like, if you don't squash your commits, it's a lot easier to be trending. And if you do 100 automated PRs, it's a lot easier to be trending. But how do you distinguish, like, okay, who's just automating their life away to, like, make sure PRs are released all the time, and who's, like, either squashing commits? Like, what's the story behind these contributions and why these folks top 10? And I think there needs to be a little bit more of a shakeup around, like, okay, what is actually trending, and what is just, like, on the list all the time. So, like, sort everything from 100 top 100 starred projects. Like, I think number 3 is, like, 99 ICU, which is, like, a massive markdown for free education and books. Like, why is that the top 10 repo on GitHub? Like, it's a lot of data and a lot of books, which is great, but it's just, like, a giant Dropbox folder for someone to drop a bunch of PDFs. But, like, and then there's, like, within the top 100, like, there's tons of, like, JavaScript interview questions, and here's this interview question, and it's which is great. Like, they belong on GitHub, but, like, when that's not a place that I'm not looking for that maintainer, because that maintainer is, like, actively not participating. Like, people are just uploading and they have other people doing stuff. So, and that's what we had to do with the GitHub. It's like, we had to, like, remove those projects, as they're not going to embed actions and CI and a bunch of other stuff in their projects. So, like, I guess we basically have to rethink on how we're thinking about the ecosystem and like what success looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree because just on on the podcast and some other stuff I've done, like I've sometimes tried to look like what beyond the noise on Twitter and stuff, like which projects are actually like getting used a lot. And then sometimes you find projects that have loads of GitHub stars, but then there's not many like issues created or like things are like kind of outdated or, this it's like a lot more complex than.
Yeah, there's a lot more nuance. Yeah, when trying to find out, is this thing still maintained? Like, just ask that question and like, how do you answer that? Like, and then like, who's maintaining this? Like, a lot of times that isn't a question that you want to ask, but like, it's not very clear until you like click a bunch of tabs or open a bunch of PRs and see who's approved, who's purged, look at the commit history. Like that becomes more challenging. Like, we're just trying to solve that, like answer that question sooner with OpenSauced. And like another, like when you talk about noise, especially with dev tools, because I see this all the time when I talk to somebody and they're like, hey, help me out with my DevRel strategy. And I honestly, my DMs are open. I'm like I love talking to early stage companies or just dev tools, open source projects about like, how do you get started in reaching out to community? And consistently they bring up their Slack channel and they're like, oh yeah, we have 2,000 or 7,000 people in Slack. And it's like, okay, cool. Yeah, what does that mean? They're like, yeah, all these people love our product. And I was like, are you sure? Like, because like it's just 7,000 people in a Slack channel is like that. It is a lot of noise, and what that tells me is like that's a lot of time. And I can probably go to, well, I benefit because I'm here in San Francisco, but I can go to Meetup and like ask somebody, hey, if you heard about this thing, and be like, oh no. They go, okay, well, they have 7,000 people in their Slack. And it's like, oh yeah, but I'm not in there. So like, what does that mean to me? But then it's also 7,000 people that are probably not paying for the thing, and they're getting free support and help and like feature requests and all this other stuff. That how do you actually sift through all that noise? In reality, like it'd be so much easier just to funnel those folks into the comment thread of a blog post or funnel that to your Twitter instead, and like that become the community, because at least that signal, it's SEO driven, or that signal is like discoverable. And then you could use that actual signal of, okay, 7,000 people in Slack, but how many active commenters? And like a lot of times what this is like when you sign up for their thing, they send an email. It's like, join our Slack, or you automatically get invited to the Slack, which is cool because like I get so every time I'll get like 8,000 unique page views because of something that went out, but we don't get 8,000 people sign up for OpenSauced. So like, how do you actually see what engagement looks like? And which is why I push everyone to, I do have a Discord. So like I'm also part of the problem, but it's like knowing what to do with that energy. Like, how do you convert that energy into, 7,000 people in my Slack? Every time we open a Stack Overflow question, it's answered within 30 seconds. Or every time we ship a blog post or a tweet, we get X, like 10% click-throughs, or we get 100,000 impressions because of like our army of Slack users. So like, how are you leveraging that to get the word out about your product is usually the question I ask. Like, cool, 7,000. Like, what are you doing with that?
Yeah. So it's like going beyond that kind of like, it's almost like a vanity one. It's like, if you just go,
it's like stars. Like having 7,000 stars in a repo is good, but like, what are you doing with this? Like, how do you, if you're a product that makes money, like how do you cash that in? There was a popular project today, and they're onboarding they had a guide. And when you went through the onboarding, part of that onboarding guide is like you authenticate with GitHub, and they had a webhook that would also start the repo after you onboarded. So like they were actually they were early in this. Sorry, I don't want to call them out directly, but they were early in a movement, like they're a new way to interact with databases. And because everyone wanted to learn how to do that thing, they had like a how to XYZ tutorial, and they went through that tutorial. You authenticate to like go build the thing you need to build, and then you would start the repo at the same time.
Oh, so they told you like, we're going to teach you how to force people to start the repo.
No, they would teach you how to use the technology.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But when you would use the technology, you would create a repo, but you'd also start their original repo.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like
Yeah, it's stars could be gamed. So like, I guess if you have over 1,000 stars, you're relevant. So like it's a top 1% of all GitHub has over 1,000 stars. So like at that point, once you get 1,000, it doesn't even matter. Like unless you're top 3 projects on GitHub, it doesn't matter because like most stars end up petering out around 50,000 today. I imagine in a couple of years it'll be 100,000 because of inflation. Inflation being like more people joining GitHub, more people learning how to code.
Printing stars.
Yeah. Stars is just like, it's not the thing to focus on.
Yeah. That's really good to hear. Do you have like things that? Do you have like a kind of a ranking of projects that I've played around? I've seen like you do, don't you? You have like you can see like the hottest kind of.
Yeah. So we have hot OpenSauced.pizza, which is it's not ranked by stars. It's ranked by most recently created. So like usually if you get like 100 stars in a day, there's like a good signal that something's happening. And that's like a better metric. It's like instead of having 100,000 stars, like how many stars you get today? And if you have 100,000 stars and you got 0 stars for the past 3 months, then it's a good signal. No one cares. But if you're constantly getting like 100 stars each day, like there's a good signal. Okay, there's something happening here, or there's something they're doing a good job at marketing, or they paid a lot of money to get folks to start their repo. But like that's a better signal, and that's like the stuff that we're actually looking at. We're not exposing this today, but we're trying to figure out rebuild what I was using internally at GitHub. And we just recently closed a round of funding, which gives us time to bring on another staff member to help engineer with us and help. We're going to start discovering some of this stuff pretty soon.
Yeah, amazing. That's very exciting. I think that's all we've got time for, Brian. But is there anything, if there was one thing that you would want like a DevTool founder listening earlier, someone working at a DevTool to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I would say number 1, build a good product. And then number 2, please talk about it. Like I think usually number 2 is where people fall off. Amazing.
And where can people learn more about you and about OpenSauced?
We have a newsletter, sauce.ghost.io. It's a scroll to the bottom of OpenSauced.pizza, and you can subscribe. We'd love more people on our newsletter talking about our product. And you can find me bdougie on Twitter, bdougie on GitHub. And if you mention me in an issue, I tend to respond to as well. So like use GitHub to reach out. Let me look at some stuff.
Amazing. Thanks for joining, Brian.
My pleasure.
And thanks everyone for listening.